Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our speaker for today's inaugural Hayden Lecture. But first, a word of thanks to Dan and Linda Lawson for their generous support in underwriting this lectureship. Dan worked, as most of you know, for many years on behalf of Emmanuel Christian Seminary, primarily fundraising, but also sharing the story of the good work done here on the Hill to anyone and everyone who would listen, and some who would not, but he told the story anyway. At the same time, through those years, his wife Linda worked tirelessly at Milligan to ensure that paychecks and related reports and such things were all delivered on time. And we thank you both for your commitment to this ministry, and we thank you today for honoring the legacy of Linda's father. We've already heard very personally about Edwin Hayden, and so this lectureship does honor an individual, an outstanding individual minister and advocate for the restoration movement. Today's speaker is Dr. Dwight Hopkins, the Alexander Campbell Professor of Theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's a graduate of Harvard University, Union Theological Seminary, and the University of Cape Town. Dr. Hopkins previously served as Professor Extraordinarius. I love that title. How does one get to be called Professor Extraordinarius? In the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa in Pretoria. He also has been a visiting professor and lecturer in China at both Renmin University and Surrey International Institute at Dongbei University, and I may not have pronounced that correctly, University of Finance and Economics. A specialist in cross-cultural communication related to religion, politics, and business, Dr. Hopkins initiated and managed a 14-country network focused on building healthy communities and healthy individuals in communities. His published work is both substantial and diverse, a sampling of which is listed on the brochure you received. He has authored and edited numerous other books and published scores of essays in journals and books. And so on behalf of Milligan College and Emmanuel Christian Seminary at Milligan, it is my honor to welcome Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm even much more humbled once I've heard the story behind the Hayden Lectures. So thank you so much. I will take that with me for a while, because for me, the older I get, it's the people who make the world go round. And once we know people, we know the world. Of course, I'm humbled to be, I guess, is the inaugural speaker. I guess I knew, but I didn't know, so that obviously puts more historic joy, not burden, for me sharing here with the community. And I'm glad you took the time to come out. The older I get and the more I travel both domestically and internationally, I realize that it is quite a privilege to have people take time out of their busy schedules just to come hear me speak. And if it was my choice, I wouldn't come to hear me speak. So thank you very much. To President Bill, to where Professor Paul is here, thank you so much for all you've done. We had a great dinner last night, so some of the conversations we'll take to our grave. We won't share here. And a special, I guess you would say, special greetings to Professor Kip, who's taking pictures, because we were, I guess, at the American Academy of Religion maybe 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago. It was quite some time ago. And he said, well, you know, if you have any time, would you like to come share? And I said, anytime. And we were able to work it out. And that was before I was the Alexander Campbell Professor. So he asked me as an unknown person 5 years ago, before I got the chair. So that's how the spirit works out. You asked me to come, and I come as the Alexander Campbell Chair Professor. So again, thank you so much. We're giving 3 lectures, and today we're going to talk about the topic of wealth and faith in Black American experiences. Wealth and faith in Black American experiences. There's a story about a man who was hungry, and so one church gave him fish every week, and this was good because it kept him from bad health and made him stronger. And then another church decided the best assistance was to give him a fishing pole so he could fish on his own and provide for his wife and children. This, too, was a big improvement. Now his family had a steady, healthy diet, and the man began to take even more responsibility for himself and his family. His sense of his own individual power, family accountability, and future potential grew more and more. And then a third church came along and worked with the man to purchase the global company that made fishing poles. Now, with ownership of his own wealth, the man's view expanded into the international arena of trade and investments, and his plans and perspectives focused on how to transfer material wealth to his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. He became more aware of how everything he did each day now had deep positive or negative impacts for several future generations of his offspring. With his family and future legacy secured, he began to think about how to help other married couples with their children. Because a church had helped him gain material wealth, he worked with other couples to own their own companies. As a result, families began to focus more on their children and their future. And at the same time, as couples owned more and more wealth, they also began to hire more and more people. The workers, likewise, had aspirations of someday supporting their children by owning businesses and, in turn, providing employment for others. Ownership of a variety of wealth provided income to improve the neighborhood schools, academic extracurricular activities, training in musical instruments. Scholarships were established to ensure that each child spent 1 year studying abroad during their elementary, junior high, and high school years. The parents focused on making sure that each child was prepared to become good global citizens and own global businesses and care for those on their local neighborhood block and for those in other countries. In fact, by following this one model among many of a church helping one married couple own an international firm, another possible pattern emerged for what it means to be a healthy family in the midst of many families. That one couple became more stable, and the homes next door developed in the same way. One block, one neighborhood, one community, one city, one state, one region, one country. And then all the countries of the world got involved in prioritizing ownership of touchable goods and services that gave back monetary rewards to each family as a basis to prepare children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Indeed, in this one model, among other possible alternatives, the family duties became more and more clear. The duty of the parents was to take care of each person every day and to turn their daily attention to their children's spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional well-being. The duty of the children became listening to the wise advice of their parents, parents who were preparing the children for a healthy future as global citizens with material resources to help those who were in need. And the duty of the grandfather and grandmother was to spend days with their grandchildren in order to teach the young the years of wisdom and future dreams of their grandparents. In this one path, among others, daily conversations began to focus more and more on matters of material wealth and management of wealth as spiritual manifestations, and how to transfer ownership of companies to their children. Children at home began to hear their fathers talk more and more about the three major aspects of financial decisions: how to invest, how to finance investment, and how to pay out the returns on investment. How do parents who own wealth calculate the present value and future value of an asset? What is the capital pricing asset model, cash flow from assets, terminal valuation, pro forma income statement, pro forma balance sheet? And what is their relationship to the net present value when a person is considering purchasing a company or not? How do parents understand the discounted interest rate in order to leverage for the best economic outcome of their children? At home, children began to hear conversations about the relationships among corporate finance, microeconomics, management accounting, financial accounting, leadership development, startups and disruptive innovations, statistics, mergers and acquisitions, emerging markets, hedge funds, crisis management, art negotiation, and social entrepreneurship. At the dinner table, when father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, sons, and daughters were eating together, the children began to listen closely. to conversations about weighted average cost of capital, sourcing deals, restructuring deals, sourcing and exiting deals after 5 years, operations, procurement, sales, standard deviations, capital asset pricing, how to start and shorten an investment, the London Metal Exchange, investment portfolios balanced with stocks, bonds, currencies, commercial real estate, oil and gas, blockchains, Internet of Things, AI, ML, the fourth industrial revolution, and BRICS, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. With these daily role models from their fathers, grandfathers, mothers, and grandmothers, children began to imitate the parents. As a result, they began to use some of their own money they'd gotten from doing house chores and holiday events to invest in the stock market. Actually, some of the sons started an investment club among children on the same block. And some of the girls started little businesses like cutting neighborhoods' grass and home delivery shopping for elders. And though these were attempts at business on the part of elementary and high school youth, the children's daily energies were focused on becoming future business leaders on their neighborhood blocks and in the world. Perhaps one of the ambitious visions was the dream of 3 children on the block who had a vision of setting up an international company that would be a global oasis. It would comprise aspects of brokering and consultancy, but it was much more comprehensive. The global oasis would be a connector, connecting people within and from different countries with various resources. The firm's question would be, what do you need from the global marketplace? And actually, the mission was to provide a global oasis, a place of ease and rest for international commerce, where business could come for resources and deals. It was actually like a worldwide Yellow Pages for those of us who know what Yellow Pages are. Suppose a company in Singapore had built electric vehicles. It had already saturated the market in Asia and was looking for market partners in Africa. Then the global oasis would find partners on the continent. Suppose a private equity fund in Ghana had received approval to provide student housing at universities. The global oasis would seek funding from angel investors and venture capital. Suppose a Silicon Valley startup had purchased licensing rights to some of the established comic companies, and now the startup was beginning a multicultural, animated streaming and needed money. Suppose a mid-level company that purchased hotels for the unemployed required an increased cash flow. Global oasis could check with the business community in China for potential resources. Suppose a private equity firm in Japan had purchased a company focused on international student education so that in the United States could receive more students from abroad. And now they're ready to sell the company. Global oasis could find a possible buyer. Suppose a company owned a plant that made generic drugs in India and wanted to get them for poor and working class people in America. Then global oasis could reach out to drug companies and offer a place for lower cost product manufacturing. Suppose a businessman had reorganized the stock exchange in Palestine and needed to internationalize his network. Global oasis could put him in contact with business people in Germany, Canada, South Africa, and Hong Kong. And suppose an Asian firm claimed it had found a drug for HIV and needed distribution patterns in Africa. Then global oasis would put that firm in contact with local companies. The bottom line of global oasis was world peace, brought about by adding value, bridging cultures, and making long-term friendships. Just think, among the many possible paths, one church fed fish to a hungry man, another church gave him a fishing pole, and a third helped him own an international business. And the world of the fathers and mothers, grandfathers and grandmothers began to change. And the children began dreaming of owning earth, air, and water, and students and professors started to study what these churches were doing. So today we want to talk about wealth, as I mentioned at the beginning of our remarks. The traditional way people talk about wealth is in the following manner. Add up your total personal assets, such as cash, retirement accounts, for those of us who still have retirement accounts, and income and your home. Then subtract the total of your liabilities, such as credit card debt, student loans, and mortgage. Another way to understand debt is to compare it to income. Income is when someone else gives you a check. If a person works for someone else, then that person is dependent on that employer to give them income in the form of cash or a check. In contrast, wealth is when you own something that's not dependent on someone else giving you an income. For example, there's sort of this imaginary story that there were two people working at the post office. One was an ordinary working person. The other person was John D. Rockefeller, who was the patriarch of the family, multi-billionaire at that time. And they both were working at, I'm not sure what John D. Rockefeller was in the story, working with the post office, but nonetheless, they were making about $40,000. And there was an economic correction or recession, and they both were laid off. And so the story goes, the question is, what did the two men do? Well, the ordinary working American guy, patriotic guy, he has to file for unemployment and look for a job. John D. Rockefeller, patriarch of a major important family in America, had a big decision to make, which of his islands he would retreat to. So that is another way of looking at the question of wealth. Now, here's another example. I recently read an article on the 15 lessons that wealthy parents talk to their children about, and I want to share them with you. Lesson number 1, understanding how money works. Wealthy parents talk to their very young children about how money works. Why am I being paid this much money by my employer? What factors determine my salary or my revenue? How do taxes work? What needs to happen to improve my finances? What are assets and what are liabilities? And how do I own wealth and get money to possess more wealth? The wealthy began this conversation, as revealed in this article. They began this conversation with their children when their children are very young. And so the children grow up understanding exactly what is the value of wealth and how much wealth do they want. In other words, the child knows how much they are worth financially, and their parents let them participate in the discussions about the household income and wealth, and they do this at a young age. Lesson number 2, wealthy parents teach their children the difference between an asset and a liability. An asset makes you money, a liability costs you money. For example, for most Americans, both the car we drive and the house we live in are liabilities. They do not create any income or revenue for you. On the contrary, they demand money from us. They demand money from me. In contrast, the wealthy focus all of their time on buying assets that bring money to their families. For instance, they might buy apartments or office buildings so they can have extra money coming to them every month for their children and offspring, even to support churches in their ministry. Lesson number 3, the wealthy teach their children not to expect anyone to take care of them. Instead, they have to do as much as possible with whatever resources they have access to. The article goes on, lesson number 4, the wealthy teach their children how to socialize and connect with other people. They introduce their children to other children, even as babies and toddlers. If their children know how to have a great conversation with other children, and if they behave well with other children, then, as the story goes, then other children will enjoy being around them and other children of the wealthy. Lesson number 5. The wealthy tell their children to stop expecting immediate results and avoid magical thinking. Don't have a lifestyle of immediate gratification. Don't live your life like a microwave oven that cooks dinner in 3 minutes. Because true wealth and true happiness do not exist in this world, have I got to have it now, and everything in my life must give me results immediately. The wealthy teach their children to have a long perspective on life. They teach them to make plans for 5, 10, and 20 years. They teach them to think about their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. Lesson number 6. Wealthy parents teach their children how to create daily habits that in the long run will give them advantage in life. Make reading a habit. Make exercise a habit. Make meditation a habit. Make spiritual development a habit. Lesson number 7. Wealthy parents teach their children that money is a tool, and money is also a very good thing. The danger is in how people use money and not money itself. And this actually reminds us of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, which says, "The love of money is the root of all evil." Lesson number 8. Wealthy parents teach their children to focus on increasing income instead of lowering expenses. Focusing more on increasing income can help people to be more creative, more disruptive, more better at surviving, cutting corners, and preparing for the future. Lesson number 9. Wealthy parents teach their children that knowledge is more valuable than money in the long run. Learn as much as you can and make learning a lifelong habit. Lesson number 10. Wealthy parents teach their children not to work for money. Have money work for you. Lesson number 11. Wealthy parents teach their children that solving problems for all of humanity puts us on the path to a better financial future. Lesson number 12. Wealthy parents teach their children to not waste time on things that do not correlate to the real world. Learn things that help people in this world, especially people who need a helping hand. Lesson number 13. Wealthy parents teach their children how to use good debt and avoid bad debt. Bad debt is when we take out loans to buy houses and cars and new phones. Good debt is when a person borrows money that will help them invest in something for their family and for their local community. Lesson number 14, wealthy parents teach their children that 80% of the results comes from 20% of the effort. Working smart with focus and discipline can bring about good results. Lesson number 15, wealthy parents teach their children that having money doesn't make you a better person. It just helps to solve some of the problems of the world. So the article concludes, remember humility when your life improves. And closely connected to humility is having respect for others. And finally, money can pay for the comforts of the body, but it can never pay for the comforts of the mind and the soul. Now, we've looked at this background about the story of one family, 3 churches. We shifted to looking at different perspectives on wealth, and now we want to zero in a little bit more on how wealth relates, particularly to Black Americans, citizens here. In reality, the majority of Black Americans in the communities in which they come from is moving away from wealth. Instead of moving forward, they're moving backwards, and the numbers are actually quite sobering. The following statistics come from an article written by Brian Thompson in Forbes magazine titled, "The Racial Gap, Addressing America's Most Pressing Epidemic." Between 1983 and 2013, the median Black American household wealth declined from $6,800 to $1,700. That is a decline of 75%. And between now and next year, 2020, many experts predict that Black household wealth will lose an additional 18% of wealth. And if this downward direction continues, by 2053, the median Black household wealth in our country will be 0. This question of how do Black Americans think about wealth and relate to wealth is really not that new. The idea that African Americans are concerned about the material well-beings of their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren goes back over a century and a half ago. Specifically after the end of the Civil War in 1865, the recently freed Black people had 3 things on top of their agenda as free men and free women. 1 was to travel throughout the South to reconnect with family members who had been sold away. 2 was education. And 3 was to buy as much land as possible. In order to take care of family members, in order to provide education for their children, recently freed fathers and mothers knew that without wealth, not much else was possible. And that is why we are amazed about how many acres recently freed blacks accumulated 10 to 20 years out of slavery. Now, I'm looking at this clock, but my father's father was enslaved in I'm from Richmond, Northern Virginia in Goochland County, for all y'all know Virginia. And he lived on the plantation, Mr. Judge's plantation. His name was Judge, he wasn't the judge. And so and my daddy said, when freedom come, my granddaddy, Mr. Judge said, y'all want to go down? I'm going to move down to Goochland County. So y'all want to come? So my father's father and his brothers moved with him into Goochland County, where my father was born. And my father's father's father, of course, they didn't have legal education, but he accumulated over 100 acres. So I think, but I went to Harvard, 2 PhDs, and I was like, what am I doing? You know, it's just quite a. So a lot of us who are today are heirs of this. How were they able to do that in such a short time? So not only do we see the issues coming up during the slavery period, but similar concerns can be found in some of the demands of the more recent 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement. We can see that some demands were also about wealth and the material well-being of black families. For instance, the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also included the demand for the hiring of black bus drivers in Negro neighborhoods. The boycott included a demand for wealth and income. The famous 1963 March on Washington demanded jobs or income. The official march slogan was jobs or freedom, jobs and freedom. To that point, though most of us remember that the famous I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King in '63, actually there was probably a more powerful theme that he followed throughout the speech before the end, I Have a Dream. And in that theme, which if you go back and listen to the full speech, he says, there is a need for Negroes to ask the U.S. federal government to cash a check to provide funds for Negro communities. That was the plumb line theme. And then King was also leading the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, which would have been his second march in Washington, the U.S. capital city, of course. And in that theme of the new second march on Washington, he focused on poor and working class people and the need for the government to shift some of its resources to remove the material load of poverty from blacks and whites and browns and yellows. He said the following: we called our 1968 demonstration a campaign for jobs and income because we felt that the economic question was the most crucial that black people and all poor people generally were confronting. He goes on to say there was literally a depression in the Negro community. He says when you have mass unemployment in the Negro community, it's called a social problem. And then he ended, when you have mass unemployment in the white community, it's called a depression, close quote. Now, in addition to the Poor People's Campaign, King's last project in the spring of '68 was supporting black working class garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, those who wanted higher wages, better material working conditions, and their full humanity recognized. Similarly, many of you may not be aware, but at the same time, Dr. King's heroic movement led by black churches and allies throughout the country and the South. Stokely Carmichael was the upstart in this youth movement, and they began this black consciousness, black power movement, which started actually on June 16th in 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi. And a lot of people are confused about this movement, but we must remember that when Carmichael and the youth wing of the civil rights movement were organizing amongst these basically black peasants, they were asking that these folks should own the land that they tilled. So even there, that was the thrust of that initial movement. And we can go on and on examples of different civil rights movements of the 60s, even all the way up to Pan-Africanist groups like the African Liberation Support Committee and Trans-Africa that fought to unite African Americans with Africa through material as well as spiritual connections. And obviously the black churches have been the pioneer examples, obviously of spiritual and physical and healing, but also providing concrete material support in terms of jobs, food, housing, etc. And also, of course, we want to add what the Bible has to say. because for many of us, and well, I can say it here, I speak all over, it's a very important book for a lot of us still, even in these troubling times. So in my read of the sacred text of the Bible, there are three major stories that emerge. First, it seems to me when we step back and frame the story of the entire Old Testament, we can make a good case based on faith and our read of ancient text and ancient languages, that the theological glue of the Old Testament is that Yahweh God liberated enslaved workers from material poverty and slavery. I think we can find this in Exodus 3, verses 7 through 8, where it says, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." End quote. So as a result, Yahweh created a covenant with these formerly enslaved workers. Yahweh said he would deliver them from earthly poverty and deliver them into concrete material resources. And the freed slaves in the covenant would own and control their own material resources. The book of Exodus talks about the God-worker-slave covenant. The book of Numbers tells a story about scouts going into Canaan land and bringing back food. And it gives us an eyewitness account of the fertility and abundance of the earth. In other words, the content of the Yahweh worker-slave covenant is for workers and the oppressed to own their own land and resources for their families and for their future offspring. And that way the lamb and the lion can be together. That way every family and community can live under their own vine and fig tree. The Old Testament gives us some evidence that part of being faithful is providing material resources for families that are suffering. And the New Testament picks up on this Old Testament covenant theme and thereby further clarifies the content and vocation of the good news. For example, the first public speech of Jesus had a specific and unique agenda, if you will, that is an eschatological spiritual agenda, which was to declare to the community the sole purpose why the Spirit had anointed him to be incarnated on earth. This first public address is eschatologically significant. That is, it changes all that there is for now and in the future. It teaches the ultimate end goal of Jesus. When God, through Jesus, explicitly tells us why God decided to reveal God's self in the decisive revelation of Jesus on earth, such a public declaration is like a presidential State of the Union address, or of the cosmos, maybe. What is the primary reason why God incarnated God's self in Jesus? For us, for many of us, to find the answer to this question, we turn to Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 20. In these words, Jesus tells us why he came to earth. And as a result, we get some sense of the relationship between salvation and material freedom, as is written in the book of Luke passage. There it says, quote, "He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.' Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him." Close quote. Now, this is how the Savior and Liberator describes the criteria of his vocational mission on earth. Not only does Jesus unambiguously, from my read of the sacred text, elaborate his own vocational criteria for success, Jesus also enunciates plainly the criteria for human success, those who follow the way. To be a Christian is to want to go to heaven ultimately, whether we believe heaven exists after death, where we eventually meet and join father, grandfather, mother, and grandmother, or my dear big mama and papa, as we used to say, or whether heaven means a better life on earth, whichever of those spectrums, the primary reward of being a Christian is to get to heaven. There we will meet Jesus. Whatever it looks like, heaven is a new life with Jesus. Jesus has already told us in Luke his sole purpose and where we can find him. That is to say, with the poor, the prisoners, the blind, and the oppressed. And it is no accident that these are the same vocational criteria for Christians. To my knowledge, there is only one clear place in the Bible where Jesus explicitly gives the vocational criteria for Christians to get into heaven. Those criteria are found in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 and following, where it reads, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' And then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" These vocational criteria for Jesus' mission, we found in Luke 4, and his mission he offers to us on earth in Matthew 25, point to, from my perspective, three types of vocations that we are called to follow. We are called by our vocation to be practical, priestly, and prophetic leaders. The practical vocation calls us to accumulate as much material resources and wealth to build a material reality so that the poor, workers, the oppressed can live life abundantly for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. The Old Testament provided material resources for the ancient Hebrew people in the land of Canaan. In Luke, Jesus said, "Today he is the fulfillment of the liberation year of Jubilee." That is to say, the oppressed become materially free. And Jesus' vocational criteria for entering heaven explicitly command us to give water, food, clothing, health, and shelter to the poor, workers, and those who are suffering. At the same time, the priestly calling commands us to bind up the wounds of the physically broken and the emotionally wounded. Jesus cured the lepers, and he healed people. And the prophetic vocation commands us to speak truth to power. The Old Testament Yahweh called Moses to go tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And similarly, in Luke 4 and Matthew 25, they both tell us stories about fighting structures that keep people down. In fact, it was his biblical faith that was the basis of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s ministry. For instance, some interpret King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the first March on Washington in August 1963 as an extraordinary oratory. And most remember, as we said earlier, the sort of the great ending where he repeats the powerful phrase, "I have a dream." But the thrust of his brilliant delivery lifted up the poverty of black working class and poor people all over America, and the need for them to have wealth and money. For instance, at the beginning of his speech, King draws on some of this understanding of wealth from the Old Testament and New Testament we just shared when he states the following. Quote, "The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. and then immediately he turns to his statement's core points of material compensation, underscoring a major purpose of this historic march on Washington 63. And he says the following. He says, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was the promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King goes on to say, it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of our nation. And so we've come to the D.C. to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice, close quote. Also, when King refers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he is restating the great words of Thomas Jefferson, which he inserted into the July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence. Now, those who study things like this will recall that Jefferson is taking the phrase from Locke. Locke's original expression is found in his document, Life, Liberty, and Property. So Jefferson meant, and anyone reading his writings knew, that the pursuit of happiness was based on the possession of property. However, King's awareness of the working poor and the propertyless citizens of the U.S. were also evident in the very first speech that he gave, December 5th, 1955. He'd just been elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was to lead the historic bus boycott there. He only had 15 minutes to prepare that speech. And then one of the sections of his speech, receiving the most thunderous applause, occurred when he proclaimed these words. And now you can hear it on YouTube. It's digitalized. He says, and you know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. Thunderous applause. There comes a time, my friends, when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation, where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. Thunderous applause. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. Thunderous applause. There comes a time. Thunderous applause. So when King gave this historic speech, written, as I said, in less than 15 minutes before the first mass meeting of the boycott, he was looking at the faces of many black women employed as domestics in the homes of white families. His eyes scanned the congregation and the thousands who listened outside of the church and saw black men who were domestics and laborers. And on the first day of the boycott of December 5th, 1955, King drove the streets of Montgomery for an hour, observing that Negroes were walking to work as an expression of solidarity with the bus boycott. In other words, Dr. King spoke, preached, and organized his Christian message while seeing the actual workers standing, sitting, and marching in front and all around him. The theology of King arose out of his experiences with black working class peoples, Christians primarily, of the South. In addition to this December 5th, 1955 speech and the August 63 speech in D.C., King's theology in support of the black struggling members of the community and of all the world's poor continues to shine forth in another famous speech, A Time to Break Silence, delivered at Riverside Church in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York City, April 4th, 1967, a year before his assassination. This speech indeed marked the first time and he unequivocally broke with the U.S. government and condemned it and its role in the war in Vietnam. This is what he says. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. it seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, and through them, the recipients of poverty programs. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. End quote. But the federal government redirected these material resources designated to lift the load of poverty from blacks and whites to fund the war in Vietnam. And King's final speech, April 3rd, 1968, the night before his assassination in Memphis, Tennessee, weaves together the themes of material wealth, the working class, and the poor. That final night before his assassination, the next day, he urges members of the congregation, he was in a church where he gave this, a Church of God in Christ Church. He urged members of the congregation to keep focus on the plight of black sanitation workers in Memphis. In raising these instructions to a general level for all church ministry, he proclaims, quote, "It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder and all its symbolism, but ultimately people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the New York, the New Atlanta, the New Philadelphia, and the New Los Angeles, and the New Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do." Close quote. King gave these 4 major sermons in 1955, 1963, 1967, and the night before his assassination in 1966. So as a major theologian, church leader, peace leader, global leader, he links together the need for material wealth and resources for the black and other working class citizens of the U.S. at the heart of his spiritual and faith. Throughout his career, King mixed stories from the Bible with whatever contemporary issue he was dealing with. But the root of all of his contemporary issues was the story of Jesus, the anointed one who was born in the poverty of a manger because his parents didn't have enough money to bribe an innkeeper for a room. One born literally in the midst of cow dung. And for those of us who spend summers on the grandfather's farm, you know what that's like, not these creches we see at Christmas. One whose sole purpose on earth was to free the material and spiritual poor and oppressed, as his words are recorded in Luke chapter 4. One who died between 2 criminals, one who was a Jew who drew on his prophetic tradition in Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, one who gave spiritual criteria for helping the material poor and workers found in Matthew 25, and the one who offered and continues to offer hope to all the world's people and all of creation. And my friends, I think the Jesus story still has something to teach us about wealth in faith and black experiences. Thank you.